The air in the warehouse didn't just smell like smoke, it smelled like the end of a very long, very disappointing book. I coughed, the sound wet and ragged in my throat, as the heat pressed against my skin like a physical hand, demanding I acknowledge the inevitability of my expiration. It was funny, in a dark, twisted sort of way, the kind of humor that only surfaces when your lungs are filling with soot and your future has been reduced to a pile of smoldering timber. The roof groaned above me, a rhythmic screech of tortured metal that served as the soundtrack to my final moments, and just beyond the wall of fire, I heard the click of heels. They were elegant, measured, and completely devoid of urgency. Lin Xinyue stepped into the small, clear pocket of air I had managed to carve out for myself, her pristine white dress an absolute mockery of the carnage surrounding us. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been placed in a kiln, utterly unaffected by the inferno. She didn't look terrified, or remorseful, or even mildly inconvenienced. She looked like she had just finished a cup of afternoon tea, her lips curled into a smile that had graced 1,000 family portraits and stolen the hearts of every suitor who ever glanced in her direction. It was a smile that promised warmth, but looking at it now, I finally understood it was a predatory mask. You really shouldn't have tried to crawl toward the ventilation shaft, Xinyue, she said, her voice soft and sweet, the kind of tone one used to soothe a wounded animal before putting it down. It's so messy when you struggle. It ruins the aesthetic of the tragedy, don't you think? I tried to speak, but the words turned into a slurry of ash and blood. My sister, the darling of our family, the girl who everyone insisted was incapable of malice, knelt down beside me. She didn't offer a hand, she didn't offer a glass of water. She reached out and smoothed a stray hair from my forehead with a tenderness that made my stomach churn. Do you know why I'm doing this? She whispered, leaning close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume, a sharp contrast to the smell of my own charred skin. Because you were always the variable I couldn't account for. You were the one thing that kept cropping up, a little piece of grit in the gears of my perfect machine. I've done this so many times, sister. I've watched you die in a car crash, in a drowning, in a poisoning. I've even watched you succumb to an accidental fall down a flight of stairs. It becomes tedious after the first dozen times, but it's always necessary. You have to be gone for me to win. The sheer absurdity of it settled over me like a cold blanket, freezing the heat of the fire. She wasn't just insane, she was archaic, a relic of some twisted time loop experiment that I had apparently been paying the price for. My consciousness flickered, the edges of my vision fraying into nothingness, and as the ceiling finally surrendered and collapsed, the last thing I saw was Mayu's face, etched in a strange, hollow sort of triumph. See you in the next life, sister, she murmured, and then the world went black. I woke up gasping, my lungs burning, not with smoke, but with the shock of a sudden, violent intake of air. I scrambled backward, my back hitting the cold, hard surface of a bedpost, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My room. My bedroom, to be precise, complete with the hideous floral wallpaper I had despised for years and the sunlight streaming through the curtains at an angle that signaled early morning. I looked down at my hands, smooth, unblemished, free of the burns and the soot and the trauma of the last 10 minutes. 1 year. I was exactly 1 year earlier. I stood up, my legs feeling like jelly, and stumbled to the full-length mirror. The reflection that greeted me was younger, softer, and arguably less exhausted by the prospect of existence. I touched my face, tracing the line of my jaw, half expecting to feel the phantom scars of that warehouse fire, but there was nothing. Just the dull, mundane reality of being Lin Xinyue, the overlooked middle child of the illustrious Lin family. A knock at the door signaled the arrival of my morning routine, a reality that suddenly felt like a comedy sketch. Xinyue? Are you awake? Breakfast is in 10 minutes. Mayu has already finished her yoga and is waiting downstairs. It was our mother, her voice dripping with that specific brand of maternal disappointment she reserved for me, the daughter who wasn't a prodigy, who wasn't a socialite, and who had the audacity to exist in the shadow of her perfect sister. I stared at the door, the memory of the warehouse fire still searing in my mind, and a slow, jagged laugh escaped my throat. If I had died, and if this was some cosmic do-over, I wasn't going to spend it playing the part of the sacrificial lamb. I dressed slowly, carefully, selecting clothes that made me feel like I was putting on armor rather than just fabric. When I descended the stairs, the scent of fresh coffee and the quiet hum of the house felt like a surreal dream. There they were, Mom, Dad, and the saint of the Lin family herself. Mayu looked up from her tablet, her smile bright and blinding, the kind of expression that could deflect a speeding bullet. Good morning, Xinyue, she chirped. You look tired. Did you sleep well? I locked eyes with her, searching for the crack in the facade, for the cold, calculating killer I had seen in the fire. But she was perfect. She was the sister who volunteered at animal shelters and aced her business exams. She didn't even blink. I had a nightmare, I said, pulling out my chair and sitting down with a clatter. I dreamt I burned to death in a warehouse. The fork in her hand paused for a microsecond, just a heartbeat, really, but I caught it. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes, those beautiful, deep pools of brown, went flat for a fleeting second. That sounds awful, she said, her voice steady. You really need to stop watching those true crime documentaries. They're terrible for your imagination. She turned back to her tablet, and I stared at the back of her head, my pulse thrumming in my ears. The game was on, and this time, I wasn't just a player, I was the one holding the board. The days that followed were a masterclass in psychological warfare, my own, not hers. I stopped reacting. When our father criticized my lack of initiative, I didn't get defensive, I just agreed with a terrifying, blank cheerfulness that visibly unsettled him. When Meiyu tried to bait me with her usual subtle, "I'm so worried about you, Xinyue, you seem so lost lately," I looked at her with a vacant expression and started talking about the weather. The more I observed, the more the cracks began to show. It wasn't just that she was successful, it was that she was impossible. She was trading stocks with a precision that would make a seasoned Wall Street veteran weep. She mentioned the results of a sporting event that hadn't happened yet, casually corrected herself when she realized the slip, and then moved on with a grace that was genuinely impressive. But the thing that truly caught my attention wasn't the foresight, it was the behavior. She was constantly scanning the room. Not in a nervous, jittery way, but in a predator-like sweep. She watched people, she checked watches, she looked at the sky. And she hated birds. It started with a trip to the park. A murder of crows had descended onto the branches of an oak tree near where we were sitting, their caws filling the air with a discordant, scratching noise. Meiyu had gone rigid. Her hand, resting on the bistro table, had clenched into a fist, her knuckles turning white. She didn't just dislike them, she looked like she wanted to murder every single one of them. She stared at the black feathers, her breathing shallow, her composure fracturing for the first time since my rebirth. I watched her, my heart racing. She wasn't just worried about birds. She was terrified of something associated with them. That night, I started following her. It wasn't hard, she was so confident in her own superiority that she never bothered to check for tails. She left the house at 2 a.m., dressed in dark clothing, her usual grace replaced by a frantic, jagged energy. She drove to a district of the city that was notoriously sketchy, a place where the streetlights were often broken and the shadows seemed to stretch long fingers across the asphalt. She pulled into an alleyway, parked her car, and ducked into a nondescript door of an old brick building. I waited for 10 minutes, my breath hitching in the cold air, before I crept up to the door. It was locked, naturally, but the lock was a simple thing, and I had learned a thing or two about security in my previous life, specifically, the kind of things one learns when one is constantly being framed for crimes one didn't commit. A hairpin, a little leverage, and the door clicked open. The apartment inside was sparse. There were no decorations, no family photos, no signs of the beloved daughter persona she cultivated. There was only one room, and it was filled with shelves. Rows and rows of journals. I walked to the nearest shelf, my fingers trembling as I reached out to pull one down. The leather was worn, the pages yellowed. I opened it. It was a diary, but not the kind where a girl writes about her crush or her day at school. It was a logbook. Timeline 14, failed. Gushin died in the accident. I returned. I flipped the page. Timeline 15, tried the poisoning. Didn't take. She survived for 3 days. It found me again. I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving me lightheaded. I pulled another one down. Timeline 31, everything went perfect, but the raven showed up on Tuesday. It knows. It always knows. There were dozens of them. A library of failed iterations. A graveyard of previous attempts. I wasn't just a sister to her, I was a resource, a variable to be burned, poisoned, dropped, and erased, all to keep the perfect timeline going. And the refrain was always the same. It found me again. The sound of a key turning in the lock sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system that was pure, unfiltered fear. I shoved the journal back onto the shelf, my hands shaking so violently I nearly dropped it. I dove behind a heavy velvet curtain that draped over the only window in the room just as the door swung open. Meiyu entered, and the change in her was immediate. The perfect, polished exterior collapsed. She looked haggard, her hair disheveled, her eyes bloodshot. She didn't turn on the lights. She walked straight to a small desk in the corner, sat down, and pulled out a fresh, unmarked journal. She didn't write. She just sat there, staring into the dark, her chest heaving with deep, ragged breaths. "I know you're watching," she whispered into the silence. I froze. Was she talking to me? Was she talking to the room? "I know you're out there, waiting for the right moment," she continued, her voice trembling. "You think you're so clever, with your little pecs and your black eyes. But I'm not done yet. I'll burn this whole world down before I let you take me. She began to write, her pen scratching against the paper like a claw. I stayed behind the curtain for what felt like hours, listening to the rhythm of her misery, realizing for the first time that the predator was just as terrified as the prey. She wasn't just the monster, she was a slave to the loop. And now, I was the one who held the map. Getting out of that apartment was a test of nerves. I waited until her breathing evened out into the rhythm of sleep, then I slipped out the door, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped drum. I didn't go home. I couldn't. I went to a 24-hour diner, sat in a corner booth, and ordered black coffee that tasted like battery acid. I had the knowledge. I knew she was repeating timelines, and I knew she was haunted by something that she referred to, the thing that apparently hunted her across realities. And I knew the name she kept mentioning in the margins of the journals, Gu Shen. Gu Shen was the CEO of a conglomerate that was currently in the process of acquiring our father's struggling firm. In my previous life, the life where I died, he had been a mysterious figure, a man who rarely appeared in public, who was rumored to be dying of a degenerative illness. Meiyu always seemed obsessed with him, though she played it off as a professional interest in his company's stock value. If the journals were right, Gu Shen was the fulcrum. In every timeline where she failed, he died. In every timeline where she succeeded, he lived, or at least, lasted long enough for her to get what she wanted. I took a sip of the bitter coffee and smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of someone who had just realized that the game wasn't rigged against me, it was waiting for me to take the controls. I didn't need to kill Meiyu. That was too simple, too messy, and clearly, it didn't work. She'd just loop back and try again. I needed to break her. The next morning, I arrived at the breakfast table early. Meiyu was already there, her usual mask firmly in place, though the dark circles under her eyes were painted over with expensive concealer. She looked up and offered a smile that looked like it had been carved out of stone. "You're up early, Xinyue," she said, her voice smooth. "Everything all right?" "Better than all right," I said, sliding into my seat and picking up the morning paper. I turned to the business section, the one she usually obsessed over. I was reading about Gu Shen's company. They're holding an auction for a private charity gala next week. High society, high stakes. I think I'm going to go. Meiyu's fork clattered against the plate. It wasn't a subtle sound this time. It was a loud, jarring noise that echoed in the quiet dining room. She looked at me, her gaze sharpening, her eyes searching my face for a hint, a clue, a weakness. "You," she said, a small, patronizing chuckle escaping her. "Xinyue, darling, that's not really your scene. It's for the top-tier influencers and the corporate elite. You'd be out of your depth before you even reached the hors d'oeuvres." I leaned forward, mirroring her posture, and smiled, not the vacant, happy smile I'd been using, but a sharp, calculating one. "Maybe I'm tired of staying in the shallow end, Meiyu. Maybe I want to see what happens when the water gets deep." She stared at me, and for the first time I saw the flicker of genuine fear. She didn't know what I knew. She didn't know I had seen the journals. She just knew that something had changed, that the variable was starting to act out of character. "Don't do anything stupid," she said, her voice dropping to a low, warning hiss. "Stupid is subjective," I replied, buttering my toast with meticulous care. "I prefer to think of it as spontaneous. I spent the next few days preparing. I didn't need to learn how to be a socialite, I needed to learn how to be a ghost. I accessed the information in the journals I had managed to skim, bits and pieces of future market trends, names of key donors, the exact sequence of events that usually led to Meiyu's accidental successes. I started feeding her false information, leaking tiny, inconsequential details to her through anonymous channels, watching as she scrambled to adjust her strategy for the future. It was glorious. I saw her panic in real time. I saw her make bad trades because I told her a tech company was going to crash. I saw her avoid a perfectly good social engagement because I dropped a hint that it would be a disaster. She was losing her grip, and the perfect timeline she was so desperate to maintain was beginning to fray at the edges. But the best part? The best part was Gu Shen. I knew, from the journals, that Gu Shen would be at the gala. I knew that he was prone to bouts of severe weakness, moments where he would have to withdraw to a private room to recover. In every previous timeline, Meiyu used these moments to corner him, to manipulate him, to force him into a position that benefited her. This time I was going to get there first. The night of the gala arrived. The ballroom was a sea of velvet and diamonds, the air thick with the smell of expensive perfume and desperate ambition. I wore a simple black dress, understated and elegant, the kind of outfit that allowed me to fade into the background. Meiyu was there, of course, looking like a queen in a gown that cost more than my car, holding court with a group of investors who were hanging on her every word. She looked beautiful. She looked untouchable. And then, she saw me. She was across the room, talking to a diplomat, when she spotted me standing near the refreshment table. She froze, her drink halfway to her lips. She didn't say a word, but her eyes locked onto mine, and the message was clear: "What are you doing here?" I winked at her and turned away. I slipped out of the ballroom, heading for the hallway where the private lounges were located. I knew the layout from the floor plans I'd studied. I found the room, the one where Gushin always retreated, and I knocked on the door. It opened, and there he was. Gushin. He was taller than he looked in photos, his face pale, his eyes weary, the eyes of a man who had seen too much and was expecting too little. He looked at me with a mix of surprise and mild annoyance. "The gala is that way," he said, his voice deep and raspy. "I know," I said, holding up a small, unmarked envelope. "But I think you're going to want to see what's inside this. It has nothing to do with stocks, or acquisitions, or charity. It has everything to do with a woman named Lin Xinyue, and the fact that she's currently running out of time." He stared at me, his gaze narrowing. He didn't invite me in, but he didn't close the door, either. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm the person who's going to save your life," I said. "And hers, if she's lucky." He looked at the envelope, then back at me, a flicker of something: curiosity? Hope, crossing his tired face. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. As I walked into the room, I glanced back down the hallway. Xinyue was standing at the entrance of the ballroom, looking down the corridor, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated dread. She knew. She didn't know what I was doing, but she knew the game had changed. The hunter had become the hunted, and I was just getting started. Gushin's private sanctuary smelled of old paper, cedar, and the distinct, bitter tang of specialized medication. He didn't sit down. Instead, he leaned against the edge of a massive mahogany desk, crossing his arms over a chest that moved with a slightly shallow, uneven rhythm. Up close, the cold CEO of the business rags looked less like an untouchable titan and more like a man who was fighting a war against his own DNA, and losing. "You have exactly 3 minutes, Gushin said, checking a classic Patek Philippe watch that looked older than my parents'. "And that's only because you have the audacity to look like you actually believe the nonsense coming out of your mouth." "Fair enough. Let's skip the pleasantries," I said, tossing the envelope onto the desk between us. Inside that envelope is a list of 3 things. First, the exact percentage by which your core tech stocks will drop at 9:15 a.m. tomorrow morning because of a freak server fire in Ohio. Second, the obscure medical trial currently happening in Switzerland that is the only thing keeping your heart pumping. And third, a detailed description of how my sister, Lin Xinyue, was planning to accidentally stumble into this exact room in about 7 minutes to offer you the solution to both of those problems. He didn't touch the envelope immediately. His eyes, sharp as broken glass, bored into mine. "And how exactly does a girl who spent her last 3 years failing to secure an entry-level marketing position obtain proprietary Swiss medical data and a future stock projection?" "Because, Mr. Gu, my sister is a cheat code in human form," I said, leaning back against the doorframe and letting out a dry, sarcastic chuckle. "And up until about 72 hours ago, I was her favorite recurring casualty. I know how this sounds. If someone told me this a week ago, I'd have checked them into a psychiatric ward. But the reality is much more annoying. She's living life with a strategy guide, and I finally stole a glance at the index." Gushin reached out, his long, pale fingers sliding the paper out of the envelope. As his eyes scanned the neatly written lines, transcribed directly from Mayu's hidden journals, the cynical tight line of his jaw slackened just a fraction. The silence stretched, heavy and tense, until he looked up, a completely different energy radiating from him. The dismissal was gone, in its place was a cold, razor-sharp focus. "Why tell me?" he asked quietly. "Because in every single one of her little diary entries, you die young," I said, stepping closer. "She needs you alive just long enough to absorb your corporate empire, but after that, you're always an afterthought. I happen to think that's a bit rude. More importantly, I need an ally who has the resources to back her into a corner she can't escape from. If she loops again, I lose my progress. I like my progress." Before he could answer, a soft, frantic knocking rattled the door. I gave Gushin a bright, theatrical wink and stepped back into the shadows of the room's heavy drapes. He didn't miss a beat. His expression smoothed back into its default setting of freezing indifference as he called out, "Enter." The door swung open, and right on cue, Lin Xinyue stepped into the room. She looked breathtaking, her cheeks flushed with just the right amount of accidental exertion, holding a small silk clutch. She had her opening line ready, I could see it in the slight parting of her lips, but the moment her eyes swept the room and landed on Gushin standing entirely unbothered, holding the very piece of paper she had spent lifetimes preparing to synthesize, her words died in her throat. "Mr. Gu," she began, her voice faltering by a fraction of an octave. I was looking for the restroom and noticed the light. Save it, Miss Lin, Gushin interrupted, his tone dry enough to kindle a fire. Your sister has already briefed me on your unique corporate espionage methods. Or should I call it, prophecy? Meiyu went entirely rigid. The carefully crafted warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, glittering panic that made her look older, sharper, and deeply dangerous. She didn't look at Gushin, her head snapped directly toward the curtain where I was standing. Xinyue, she hissed, her voice dropping the sweet sister act entirely. What did you do? I stepped out from the velvet drapes, dusting off my sleeves with an air of immense boredom. Just doing some networking, sister. You always said I lacked initiative. I decided to take your advice. Oh, by the way, you might want to check your phone. I took the liberty of short-selling that tech stock you were hoarding. You're going to lose about 40 million by breakfast. For a second, I thought she was going to lung at me. Her manicured nails dug into her silk clutch so hard the fabric groaned. But it wasn't just anger distorting her beautiful face, it was sheer, unadulterated terror. She wasn't looking at me anymore, she was looking past me, toward the high, arched windows of the private lounge. Outside, silhouetted against the bright city lights, a massive black raven was perched on the stone ledge, its beak tapping rhythmically against the glass. Tap. 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 Meiyu let out a choked, whimpering sound and took a step back, hitting the doorframe. No, she whispered. Her hands shaking violently. Not yet. I have a whole year left. It's not time. It's always time when you break the rules, Meiyu, I said, though my own heart was hammering against my ribs. Seeing the raven up close made the hairs on my arms stand up. There was something profoundly unnatural about the way it stared through the glass. Its eyes weren't bird-like, they were heavy with an ancient, mocking intelligence. She didn't stay to fight. Turning on her heel, Meiyu bolted out of the room, the frantic clatter of her heels echoing down the marble hallway like a dying heartbeat. Gushin looked from the window to me, his brow furrowed. What the hell was that? That, I said, letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, is the monster behind the timelines. And I think it's time we find out exactly what kind of deal my sister made. Breaking into Meiyu's secret apartment a second time was significantly easier with a corporate security detail supplied by a billionaire. Gushin's men bypassed the building's locks in under 30 seconds, leaving me standing in the center of the dark, journal-lined room while Gushin himself leaned against the doorframe, adjusting his cuffs as if we were visiting an art gallery rather than committing a felony. You have strange family traditions, he noted, looking at the walls covered in identical leather-bound books. We're overachievers, I muttered, walking straight to the back wall where the oldest journals were kept. I pulled down timeline number 1. If I wanted to understand the rules of this twisted game, I had to see how the contract was signed. The handwriting in the first journal was erratic, stained with tears and what looked suspiciously like dried blood. I sat on the floor, flipping through the pages while Gushin stood over me, his shadow falling across the yellowed paper. Years ago, I murmured, reading the frantic script aloud, Meiyu failed her university entrance exams. The family was going to disown her, well, as much as our parents can disown their favorite child. She ran away in a storm. She met something. An entity. A shadow with feathers. I flipped the page, my eyes widening as the text became clearer. It offered me a trade, Meiyu had written. A clean slate. A chance to start the year over with all my memories intact. All I had to do was provide a tether. A soul to absorb the temporal friction. It said the closer the blood, the stronger the anchor. Xinyue won't mind. She's quiet anyway. She doesn't use her life for anything important. The words hit me like a physical blow. I let out a sharp, breathless laugh that tasted like copper. She sacrificed me, I whispered, the reality of dozens of deaths settling into my bones. Every single time she messed up a timeline, every time she lost money, or failed to secure a contract, or let you die too early, she just killed herself or waited to die, knowing that the universe would reset. But the reset button required a toll. And I was the currency. Gushin reached down, his hands surprisingly warm as his fingers closed around my shoulder, pulling me up from the floor. His face was unreadable, but his jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle twitched in his cheek. She didn't just steal your future, Lin Xinyue. She turned your entire existence into a battery. Well, I said, blinking back a sudden, furious wave of moisture in my eyes and forcing a bitter smile. The battery is officially dead, and the machine is running on empty. Look at the last entry of every book. It found me again. The raven isn't her familiar. It's the collector. Every time she resets, the entity gets a little hungrier, and its presence stretches deeper into the timeline. She's not living in fear of me, she's living in fear of the debt coming due. So how do we collect? Gushin asked, his voice dripping with a cold, corporate malice that made me deeply glad he was on my side. We don't have to do anything except stop her from resetting, I said, a slow, malicious joy blooming in my chest. She relies on predictability. She relies on knowing exactly when the car will crash, when the building will burn, when the market will turn. If we introduce total, chaotic variation, she won't know how to die safely. If she dies without preparing the anchor, the loop breaks. And the collector takes the debtor. For the next 3 weeks, I became Lin Xinyue's living, breathing nightmare. I stopped hiding in the shadows. I moved into the family home full-time, taking the bedroom right across the hall from hers. Every morning, I would greet her with a cheerful, terrifyingly specific comment. When she poured her morning coffee, I'd whisper, "Careful, sister. Timeline 34 had arsenic in the brew." Or was it 35? I always mix up the mid-30s. When she tried to leave for a business meeting, she would find her tires slashed, and a small, beautifully folded origami raven resting on her windshield. I hired actors to sit in cafes she frequented, dressed entirely in black, holding copycat journals and staring at her without blinking. I bought airtime on local radio stations just to play the sound of birds cawing on a loop during her morning commute. She stopped sleeping. The flawless, porcelain skin she was so proud of turned a sallow, translucent gray. Her hair lost its luster, and her eyes darted constantly to the corners of the ceiling, looking for shadows that weren't there. She looked like a ghost inhabiting a corpse. Our parents were beside themselves with worry, but every time they tried to intervene, Gushin's legal team conveniently tied up our father's company in routine audits, keeping them too distracted by impending bankruptcy to notice that their favorite daughter was losing her mind. The climax arrived on a Tuesday, the exact day, according to her old journals, where she usually secured the merger with Gushin's firm. I found her in the study of our family home, the room completely dark except for the moonlight streaming through the French doors. She was sitting on the floor, surrounded by shredded papers, her fingers bleeding where she had torn her own nails to the quick. "Stop it," she gasped the moment I walked in, her voice sounding like dry leaves scraping against pavement. "Please, Xinyue. Just let me have this one. If I get the merger, I can fix it. I can find a way to pay it back without using you. I promise." "Oh, now you want to negotiate?" I said, sitting gracefully in our father's leather armchair, crossing my legs. Where was this diplomatic spirit when you pushed me into the path of a speeding delivery truck in timeline 42? Or when you locked the emergency exit in that warehouse? You know, smoke inhalation really hurts, Xinyue. It's a very undignified way to go. You don't understand, she shrieked, scrambling backward until her back hit the desk. You think you're winning, but if I don't reset, it takes everything. It doesn't just take my life, it erases my existence. No one will remember me. Good, I said flatly. That sounds like an incredibly efficient filing system. She looked at me, her eyes wild with a sudden desperate realization. From her pocket, she pulled a small, silver pocket knife, the one she kept for emergencies. Her hand was shaking, but she pointed the blade at her own throat. If I die right now, she whispered, a manic, terrifying smile breaking through her tear-stained face, the loop triggers automatically. It's hardwired into my blood. I'll go back to the beginning. I'll wake up a year ago, and I will kill you before you ever have a chance to remember. If I die right now, she whispered, a manic, terrifying smile breaking through her tear-stained face, the loop triggers automatically. It's hardwired into my blood. I'll go back to the beginning. I'll wake up a year ago, and I will kill you before you ever have a chance to remember. I didn't move. I didn't panic. I just took a sip from a glass of water I had brought with me. Go ahead, I said smoothly. She blinked, confused by my lack of terror. I'll do it, Xinyue. I'll reset the world. You can try, I said, pointing a finger toward the French doors behind her. But you forgot to check the anchor. The glass doors rattled violently. Outside, the night sky wasn't blue or black anymore, it was a writhing mass of solid, oily feathers. Hundreds, no, thousands, of ravens had descended upon the house, their bodies pressed against the glass, their collective weight causing the wood frame to groan under the pressure. The sound of their cawing wasn't loud, it was a low, vibrating hum that shook the floorboards beneath our feet. The center of the mass parted, and a figure stepped forward on the balcony. It didn't have a face, just a shifting, vertical tear in reality that smelled of burnt ozone and ancient, forgotten dust. Xinyue dropped the knife. The silver blade clattered harmlessly against the hardwood floor. No, she whimpered, her voice dropping to a tiny, childlike squeak. Please, don't let it take me. Xinyue, please. We're sisters. We share the same blood. We did, I said, standing up and walking backward toward the hallway door, out of the blast radius of whatever cosmic debt collection was about to occur. But you spent all of mine. I'm fresh out of cash, Xinyue. The French doors shattered. There was no explosion, no spectacular display of light. There was only a sudden, violent rush of freezing cold wind that smelled of old graves. A mass of black feathers flooded the room, obscuring my sister from view. I heard her scream, a loud, piercing sound that cut through the night, but the scream didn't fade out. It sounded like it was being stretched, pulled thin across a distance of miles and centuries, until it simply ceased to be. When the wind died down, the room was empty. The shredded papers were gone. The knife was gone. The shattered glass from the doors was gone. In fact, the French doors were perfectly intact, gleaming under the quiet, ordinary moonlight. I stood in the silence, my chest heaving, waiting for the world to distort, waiting for the sudden, violent intake of air that would signal another morning with hideous floral wallpaper. Nothing happened. The clock on the wall continued to tick. 11:45 p.m. Then 11:46 p.m. The loop was broken. 3 months later, the world had adjusted to a reality that only two people truly understood. To my parents, Lin Xinyue had never existed. When I gently asked our mother about her other daughter a week after the incident, she had looked at me with genuine confusion, asking if I was finally crackling under the pressure of taking over the family business. Every portrait in the house featured only me. The extra bedroom was just a guest lounge. The universe, it turned out, was an exceptionally tidy housekeeper when it came to bad debts. Gushin's health had improved dramatically, thanks to the Swiss trial we had successfully funded using the capital we saved by avoiding Meiyu's disastrous stock predictions. We weren't a couple, he was far too cynical and I was far too tired for romance, but we had become a formidable corporate partnership. We ran the city, and we did it without a strategy guide. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when I returned to my private office at the top of the Lin Tower. The city below was shrouded in gray mist, the traffic moving like miniature plastic toys on a grid. I sat at my desk, letting out a long sigh of genuine contentment. I had a life. A real, linear, unrecycled life. A light knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. "Come in," I said, expecting my secretary with the afternoon balance sheets. Instead, a courier stepped inside, wearing a dripping yellow raincoat. He held a small, square package wrapped in heavy brown paper, tied with a simple piece of twine. "Delivery for Miss Lin. No return address." The guy who dropped it off just said it was overdue. "Thank you," I said, tossing a tip across the desk. I waited until the courier left before I picked up the small scissors to snip the twine. The paper fell away, revealing a familiar, worn leather-bound book. My breath hitched in my throat. My heart, which hadn't accelerated like this in months, began a frantic, jagged rhythm against my ribs. It looked exactly like Meiyu's journals. But the leather was darker, and the smell that wafted from the pages wasn't cedar, it was the distinct, sharp scent of wood smoke and a burning warehouse. With trembling fingers, I opened the cover. The handwriting on the very first page wasn't my sister's elegant, precise script. It was messy, frantic, and unmistakably my own. The first line read, "Timeline 74 has begun. If you are reading this, Xinyue, it means she managed to find a way around the collector again. Don't look out the window. It's already on the ledge." From the glass pane behind my desk, a sharp, rhythmic sound broke the silence of the room. Tap. Tap. Tap.